What happens when a billionaire's ego is bigger than his sailing skills? The U.S. Coast Guard found out the hard way. Imagine dropping $50 million on a luxury yacht only to wreck it within 48 hours. That's exactly what tech billionaire Richard Carson did last summer off the California coast. But the story doesn't end with the sinking yacht. What happened next triggered one of the largest Coast Guard responses in recent history, involving helicopters, rescue boats, and an environmental emergency team. Today I'm breaking down the entire disaster, from the fateful decision that started it all to the massive cleanup operation that's still ongoing. And trust me, what the Coast Guard found underwater will shock you. The date was July 15, 2024, a crystal-clear summer day along the California coastline. Perfect weather for sailing, or so Richard Carson thought. Carson had just finalized the purchase of his dream vessel 2 days earlier, a 220-foot superyacht called Maverick's Fortune, custom-built by Dutch shipbuilders to the tune of $52 million. Now, Carson wasn't your typical billionaire, if there is such a thing. He made his fortune in the early 2000s with a tech security company that he eventually sold to Google for an eye-watering sum. Since then, he developed a reputation for extreme sports and risky adventures: rock climbing without ropes, helicopter skiing in avalanche zones, deep cave diving. You name a dangerous hobby, Carson probably had the premium gear for it sitting in one of his 7 homes. But sailing, that was new territory for him. Sure, he'd been on plenty of yachts, usually as a guest at lavish parties thrown by fellow tech moguls. But actually navigating one of these massive vessels, that requires years of experience and specialized knowledge. Carson, however, wasn't known for his patience. After taking ownership of Maverick's Fortune, he declined the shipyard's offer to provide an experienced captain and crew for the first few months. "I've watched enough YouTube videos," he reportedly told the shipyard manager. "How hard can it be?" Those words would come back to haunt him less than 48 hours later. Carson invited a group of friends, mostly tech executives and a couple of celebrities, for the maiden voyage. The plan was simple: cruise down the California coast from San Francisco to Los Angeles, stopping at scenic spots along the way. The yacht was fully stocked with premium champagne, gourmet food prepared by a chef Carson had flown in from France, and enough entertainment equipment to keep everyone busy for days. Everything started smoothly enough. The group left San Francisco Bay around 10 a.m. The weather was perfect, sunny with light winds and calm seas. Carson stood proudly at the helm, sunglasses reflecting the morning light, one hand on the wheel while the other held a mimosa. What Carson didn't know, what he couldn't have known without proper training, was that piloting a 220-foot yacht is nothing like driving a car or even a small boat. These massive vessels have complex systems for navigation, propulsion, and stability. They respond slowly to steering inputs and can be affected by currents and winds in ways that aren't immediately obvious. By early afternoon, the group had made it about 80 miles south, approaching the waters near Monterey Bay. This is where things started to go wrong. Monterey Bay is known for its sudden weather changes and challenging underwater topography. The continental shelf drops off steeply here, creating unique current patterns that can catch even experienced sailors off guard. According to witnesses on shore, the Maverick's Fortune began making erratic maneuvers around 2 p.m. Instead of maintaining a steady course parallel to the shoreline, the yacht appeared to zigzag, sometimes heading directly toward land before veering back toward deeper water. One witness, a retired Coast Guard officer named Michael Trent, who happened to be watching through binoculars from his cliffside home, later told investigators, "It looked like whoever was at the helm had no idea what they were doing. The yacht was moving like a drunk person trying to walk a straight line." What was happening on board? Based on interviews with survivors and Carson himself, we now know that a series of cascading errors led to disaster. First, Carson had ignored several warnings from the yacht's sophisticated navigation system. Modern superyachts come equipped with detailed electronic charts that show underwater hazards, depth changes, and recommended sailing lanes. But Carson had dismissed the alerts as too annoying and had actually turned off some of the warning systems. Second, he had misunderstood the yacht's handling characteristics. When approaching a section of shallow water marked on charts as Monterey Pinnacles, an area known for underwater rock formations, Carson attempted to turn the yacht sharply to avoid them. But large vessels can't turn on a dime. They need space and time. The yacht's momentum carried it directly toward the hazard Carson was trying to avoid. What's worse, in his panic, he increased power to the engines, thinking this would help turn the vessel faster. Instead, it just drove the yacht more forcefully toward the rocks. At approximately 2:17 p.m., the hull of Maverick's Fortune made contact with the underwater rocks. The sound, as described by passengers, was like 1,000 car crashes happening at once. The initial impact tore a 30-foot gash along the port side of the hull, below the waterline. Modern yachts are designed with watertight compartments specifically to prevent total sinking in case of a breach. But here's where Carson's third critical error came into play. During the initial tour of the yacht 2 days earlier, engineers had explained the emergency procedures, including how to seal the compartments in case of a hull breach. Carson had nodded along but later admitted he wasn't really paying attention. So when the hull was breached, Carson didn't know how to activate the emergency seals. Water began pouring in at an alarming rate. Within minutes, the yacht began listing heavily to port. Panic broke out among the passengers. Some screamed, others froze in shock. A few immediately headed for the life rafts. Carson, to his credit, did try to take control of the situation. He ordered everyone to put on life jackets and gather on the upper deck. He also finally did the one thing he should have done much earlier. He called for help. At 2:23 p.m., Carson used the yacht's radio to issue a mayday call. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the yacht Maverick's Fortune. We've hit rocks near Monterey Bay and are taking on water. We have 14 people on board. Request immediate assistance. The call was picked up by Coast Guard Station Monterey, which immediately initiated a rescue response. What followed was one of the most comprehensive maritime rescue operations in recent years. The Coast Guard's response was nothing short of extraordinary. Within minutes of receiving Carson's distress call, they deployed assets from multiple stations. A helicopter was airborne from Air Station San Francisco within 15 minutes. 2 rescue boats launched from Station Monterey. Additional units were put on standby at stations up and down the coast. Meanwhile, back on the sinking yacht, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The vessel was now tilting at nearly 30 degrees, making it difficult for passengers to maintain their footing on the slick decks. Emergency power had kicked in after the main engines flooded, providing minimal lighting and communications. Carson later described these moments as surreal. One minute we're sipping champagne and talking about our next tech investments, and the next we're clinging to railings trying not to slide into the ocean, he told investigators. As water continued to flood in, the yacht's bow began to rise, indicating that the stern was filling with water faster than the front. This created an even more dangerous situation, as objects, including furniture, equipment, and supplies, began sliding toward the submerging rear of the vessel. One passenger, tech executive Sophia Chen, suffered a broken arm when a sliding bar cart pinned her against a wall. Another guest, actor Jard Mills, sustained head injuries when he fell down a stairwell that had become nearly vertical due to the yacht's tilt. By the time the first Coast Guard helicopter arrived overhead at approximately 2:42 p.m., the Maverick's Fortune was in dire straits. The stern was nearly underwater, with only about half of the yacht still above the surface. Passengers had gathered on the highest accessible point, the foredeck, and were waving frantically at the approaching helicopter. The Coast Guard helicopter crew, led by Lieutenant Commander Sarah Perkins, quickly assessed that the yacht could fully sink at any moment. They began hoisting operations immediately, lowering a rescue swimmer to coordinate the evacuation from the deck. When I was lowered onto that yacht, I could literally feel it sinking beneath my feet, Coast Guard rescue swimmer Petty Officer Michael Domings later recalled. We had minutes, not hours. The rescue itself was complicated by several factors. First, the yacht was still drifting, pushed by currents toward even more treacherous waters. Second, several passengers were injured and needed special handling during the hoist operation. And third, the helicopter could only take a limited number of people at once, meaning multiple trips would be necessary. The first to be hoisted were the injured passengers, Chen with her broken arm and Mills with his head injury. Next came those who appeared most at risk of panic, including a tech executive's spouse who had begun hyperventilating. Carson, to his credit again, insisted on being the last passenger evacuated. While the helicopter was conducting its operations, the Coast Guard boats arrived on scene and began circling the sinking yacht. Their primary role at this point was to establish a safety perimeter and be ready to rescue anyone who might end up in the water. By 3:30 p.m., all 14 people from the yacht had been safely rescued, either hoisted into the helicopter or taken aboard the rescue boats. Just 7 minutes after the last person, Carson, was evacuated, the Maverick's fortune slipped beneath the waves entirely, leaving only a slick of fuel and floating debris on the surface. But the Coast Guard's work was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. You see, when a $52 million superyacht sinks, it doesn't just disappear. It becomes what maritime authorities call a hazard to navigation and potentially an environmental disaster. The Maverick's fortune carried approximately 15,000 gallons of diesel fuel, various lubricating oils, sewage, and numerous other potentially hazardous materials. Within hours of the sinking, Coast Guard environmental response teams were on site, deploying containment booms to control the fuel spill that had already begun to spread from the wreck. Simultaneously, notifications went out to various environmental agencies, including the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. The area where the yacht sank happened to be part of the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, one of the largest protected marine areas in the United States. Home to dozens of marine mammal species, hundreds of fish species, and thousands of invertebrate species, the sanctuary represents one of the most diverse marine ecosystems in the world. In other words, Carson couldn't have picked a worse place to sink his new toy. The environmental response quickly escalated to involve multiple agencies. By nightfall, sophisticated monitoring equipment was being deployed to track underwater plumes of fuel and oil. Aerial surveys were scheduled for first light the next morning to assess the spread of surface contamination. But even as these efforts were underway, another aspect of the Coast Guard's response was ramping up: the investigation into how and why this disaster occurred in the first place. Coast Guard investigators interviewed Carson and his passengers immediately after they were brought ashore. What emerged was a picture of staggering negligence and hubris. Carson admitted that he had no formal training in piloting vessels of any size, let alone a 220-foot superyacht. He confessed to turning off warning systems because they were distracting. He acknowledged ignoring the shipyard's strong recommendation to hire a professional captain and crew. "I guess I thought that because I could run a tech company, I could run anything," Carson later told investigators in a moment of rare self-awareness. "I was wrong." But the investigation also revealed something else, something that took the case from mere negligence to potential criminal liability. Toxicology tests, standard procedure in maritime accidents, showed that Carson had a blood alcohol content of 0.14%, well above the legal limit for operating a vessel. Not only had Carson been untrained and overconfident, but he'd also been drunk at the helm of a 220-foot, 500-ton vessel carrying 13 other people through protected waters. The Coast Guard's Criminal Investigation Division quickly became involved, and within 48 hours, Carson was facing multiple charges, including operating a vessel while intoxicated, negligent operation resulting in a marine casualty, and violations of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. But the criminal case was just one part of the unfolding disaster. 4 days after the sinking, while environmental cleanup was still ongoing, the Coast Guard made another discovery that elevated the incident to national news. Using remote-operated underwater vehicles, ROVs, to assess the wreck and plan for potential salvage operations, Coast Guard technicians found something unexpected sitting in a storage locker in the yacht's partially crushed hull: approximately 50 kilograms of cocaine, with an estimated street value of over $2 million. Carson, already in legal hot water, immediately denied any knowledge of the drugs. "I just bought the boat. I never even went into half the storage areas," he protested. But the discovery prompted the involvement of the Drug Enforcement Administration and a whole new line of investigation. Tracking the cocaine's origin became a priority. Had it been placed there by someone at the shipyard? Was it left over from a previous owner of components used in the yacht's construction? Or was one of Carson's guests using the maiden voyage as a smuggling opportunity? As these investigations continued, the environmental impact of the sinking became increasingly apparent. Despite the rapid response and containment efforts, An estimated 4,000 gallons of diesel fuel escaped into the sanctuary waters before the leaks could be fully contained. The timing couldn't have been worse from an ecological perspective. July is when several endangered whale species migrate through the area, and the accident happened near a known feeding ground. Reports of oil-covered seabirds began coming in within days. A juvenile humpback whale was spotted swimming erratically near the spill area, though scientists couldn't immediately confirm if its behavior was related to fuel exposure. The cost of the environmental cleanup quickly soared past $3 million, with no end in sight. And guess who was legally responsible for every penny? Richard Carson. Under maritime law and environmental protection statutes, the owner of a vessel is financially responsible for damages and cleanup costs resulting from a spill, regardless of fault or intent. Carson's insurance would cover some of it, but his policies had clauses excluding coverage for operator negligence and criminal activity, both of which were now in play. 10 days after the sinking, with criminal charges mounting and cleanup costs soaring, Carson held a press conference. Gone was the brash tech billionaire with the oversized ego. In his place stood a subdued, visibly shaken man who seemed to have aged a decade in a week. "I want to apologize," he began, voice cracking slightly. "To the Coast Guard who risked their lives to save mine, to the passengers who trusted me with their safety, to the people of California whose protected waters I've damaged. My arrogance and irresponsibility led to this disaster, and I am prepared to face the consequences." Carson announced that he was establishing a $10 million fund for environmental restoration in Monterey Bay, separate from whatever damages he might legally be required to pay. He also pledged to fund a new boating safety education program, specifically focused on wealthy individuals who might be tempted to operate vessels beyond their capabilities. "Money doesn't make you competent," he said, in what became the most quoted line from his statement. "Sometimes it just makes your mistakes bigger and more damaging." The Coast Guard's handling of the Carson yacht disaster has been studied as a model of effective emergency response. From the initial rescue to the environmental containment to the criminal investigation, each element was executed with precision and professionalism. Lieutenant Commander Perkins, who led the helicopter rescue, was later awarded the Coast Guard Medal for her actions. Rescue swimmer Domings received the Coast Guard Achievement Medal. The entire environmental response team was recognized with unit commendations. As for the wreck itself, salvage operations began 3 weeks after the sinking. The decision to recover the yacht rather than leave it in place came after environmental assessments showed continuing risks from remaining fuel and other hazardous materials that couldn't be safely extracted underwater. The salvage operation was one of the most complex undertaken in the area in decades. It involved specially designed lifting bags, underwater cutting equipment, and a massive crane barge brought in from San Diego. The operation cost an estimated $4.5 million, all billed to Carson. When portions of the yacht were finally brought to the surface nearly a month after the sinking, they revealed the extensive damage caused by the initial impact and subsequent collapse on the seafloor. Marine biologists also documented how quickly sea life had begun colonizing the wreck, a sobering reminder of nature's resilience, but also of the artificial reef effect that can complicate removal of sunken vessels from sensitive areas. The criminal case against Carson concluded 6 months after the incident with a plea deal. He admitted guilt to operating a vessel under the influence, negligent operation, and environmental violations. In exchange for his guilty plea and his commitment to pay for all damages and cleanup costs, eventually totaling nearly $18 million, Carson received a suspended sentence of 3 years, 1,000 hours of community service, and a lifetime ban from operating any vessel larger than 24 feet within U.S. waters. The cocaine investigation took longer to resolve. Eventually, after extensive investigation, authorities determined that the drugs had been hidden in the yacht before Carson's purchase, concealed within specially modified ballast components installed during construction. 3 employees of the shipyard were ultimately charged in connection with the smuggling operation, which had apparently been using luxury yacht deliveries as a distribution method for several years. Carson was cleared of any involvement with the drugs, though the discovery did lead to a thorough audit of his business operations and personal finances by various regulatory agencies, adding insult to his already substantial injuries. Today, more than 9 months after the disaster, the environmental monitoring of Monterey Bay continues. While the immediate crisis has passed, scientists expect it will take years to fully understand the incident's impact on the sanctuary's delicate ecosystem. Tourism in the area took a significant hit in the weeks following the spill, with whale-watching tour and diving expedition seeing cancellations of up to 60%. The local fishing industry also suffered as consumers worried about contamination, despite assurances from health officials that seafood from the region remained safe. Carson, for his part, has maintained a low profile since his sentencing. Friends say the experience fundamentally changed him. He's reportedly sold several of his homes and his collection of exotic cars, simplified his lifestyle, and focused on fulfilling his community service obligations, much of which involves speaking to wealthy individuals about the consequences of privilege without responsibility. The yacht disaster has entered Coast Guard training materials as a case study in emergency response, environmental protection, and the investigation of maritime incidents. It's also become a cautionary tale in the world of luxury yachting, where there's been a push for stricter certification requirements for owners who wish to operate their own vessels. So what can we learn from this extraordinary chain of events? First, expertise matters. Money can buy you almost anything, but it can't instantly give you the skills and knowledge that take others years to develop. Carson's belief that he could master yacht handling through sheer confidence and a few instructional videos nearly cost him and his friends their lives. Second, emergency services like the Coast Guard train relentlessly for good reason. When disaster strikes, their preparation and professionalism make the difference between life and death. The flawless execution of the rescue operation saved 14 lives that day. Third, environmental protection laws exist for a reason. Monterey Bay's designation as a marine sanctuary wasn't arbitrary bureaucracy. It was a recognition of the area's ecological importance and vulnerability. The ongoing impact of the spill shows why such protections are necessary. And finally, accountability matters. From Carson's admission of responsibility to the criminal charges to the financial obligations placed on him, the aftermath of the disaster demonstrated that our actions have consequences, regardless of our wealth or status. The story of the Maverick's fortune is more than just a tale of a billionaire's folly. It's a reminder of the forces we can't control, the expertise we should respect, and the fragile natural world we all have a duty to protect.